Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so uh, this is a pretty meaty book. I think I don't know, like it's weighty, and I was just saying before that I was reading the other book that I took on before this was a book called The Overstory, which was a fiction book, but I loved it and really connected to what Marie was talking about there. Um, uh, but it took me about a year to read it, and I decided this year was one of my new kind of goals in life was to be able to read books faster. So I really wanted to kind of get into this, and so whenever Andy asked me, I was like, "Yeah, that's the book I'm going to go for." So it gave me like a bit of a drive to get through the 500 pages and take it on. So it was a real achievement for me personally. It's been a while since I've actually physically read a book like that. Um, but yeah, and I've been aware of Gabor Mate for a while, and hadn't actually read any of his other books, just listened to him on podcasts. So this one, when it came out, he was saying it was kind of like his, opus of all the things that he brought together. So it felt like a really good starting point. And there's actually 5 sections in the book, which would have been a really logical jumping off point for 5 things. But as I was trying to pull the talk together, I just felt like it's probably like you can't fit them all in. So I just thought I'd pull out 5 things that resonated with me personally, because I am in no ways an expert in any of this stuff. So let's jump in. So the first one for me is this theme of trauma and what is trauma. And this seems to be really underlying the whole, his whole work. And he entitles the first section, Our Interconnected Nature. So he's really going into this concept that we don't just exist independently. Again, a lot of what you were saying, Maria, relates to this. We actually need to realize that we're living in a very interconnected way, and it's difficult to like continue to win when others are losing, and the systems that we live in are perpetuated often rather than helping this cycle. So we need to start thinking about how we can change the systems that we're living in. So trauma, what is trauma? Trauma, according to Mate, means wound. So we're all wounded in different ways, and our woundedness, or more specifically, how we cope with it, dictates much of our behavior and informs our way of thinking about the world. So he points out that it typically rears its head in our closest partnerships. And I really like this phrase, causing all types of relational mischief, which definitely resonated. And I'm sure everybody sees this in your own friendships and relationships. So he talks about this trauma cascading through our culture via social relationships, parenting, education, economics, and politics. And he says that someone without the marks of trauma would actually be an outlier in society today. So another way to think about trauma is an inner injury, a lasting rupture or split within the self due to an illness or due to difficult or hurtful events that come up. So he says trauma is not what happened to you, but what happens inside of you as a result of the event. And the trouble with trauma is that we often don't know that it's even there. It might never be acknowledged. And until we work through it, we can be kept stuck in the past. It can become a barrier to growth and a person's sense of worth. He says that if it happens early enough in childhood, it can even impede healthy brain development in children. He even goes into talking about how even when we're in the womb, that can affect the things that are going on in the lives of our parents, can affect them, the brain development and what the infant or fetus is experiencing, and goes into lots of science to back this up as well. Something new to me was when you talked about big T trauma and small T trauma. He defined big T trauma as like when things happen to vulnerable people that should not have happened, such as a child being abused or violence in the family, or a rancorous divorce or the loss of a parent. And then small T trauma, which was really interesting, was the seemingly insignificant but hurtful and far more prevalent misfortunes of childhood. And both kinds of trauma represent a fracturing of the self and our relationship to the world. It's about a loss of connection to ourselves, our families, and the world around us. And this loss can sometimes be hardly recognized as it happens slowly over time. So he also says that trauma separates us from our bodies, splits us off from our gut feelings, and can foster a shame-based view of the self. And ultimately, another phrase he uses is that trauma separates us from the present. So we tend to live in the past or in the future and not where we are right now. So yeah, that's trauma. And again, it's a lot to take in a very small thing, but that kind of hopefully gives an idea of what he's talking about. The next thing for me is suppression. And again, wasn't really sure where he was going with this, but he does say that, it may be disconcerting for us to consider that we might think of ourselves as having a happy childhood and being quite well adjusted. But we may fall somewhere on the trauma spectrum, even, if it's quite far away from the capital T trauma pole. And whatever that trauma we've experienced, whether it was just not being listened to, or not having somebody listen to us as we were a kid, we find coping mechanisms. And the main two he talks about are suppression and addiction. So there's a whole section on addiction, which I won't go into. And he's actually written another book on addiction called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. But really, really helpful on addiction, really interesting to go into where that comes from. But suppression, something I thought might be, for me, easy to bring out was when someone consistently and deliberately chooses not to express how they feel. So, this might come out in the office, passive aggressive notes, but more seriously, he lists a growing number of physical traits that are prominent with chronic illnesses, which range from cancer to autoimmune diseases to skin conditions to things like ME. So these traits, when I read them, I was like, gosh, I see these in so many people, and myself and my partner and my friends, that it was really something to think about. So the 5 traits that he lists are an automatic and compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring one's own. Then a rigid identification with social role, duty, and responsibility. Overdriven, externally focused multitasking, hyper-responsibility based on the conviction that one must justify one's existence by doing and giving. Repression of healthy self-protective aggression and anger, which is, fascinating. And harboring and compulsively acting out to beliefs like, I am responsible for how other people feel and I must never disappoint anyone. And essentially saying these traits, if they are present, or they are present when they look at people with certain illnesses, and so he's building this connection between something that's going on. In fact, I think one thing that struck me was he talked about ALS and how they talked about it in some professions as the nice person's disease, because, it's just often the people who have it are just so nice. And sometimes they'll say that person doesn't have ALS, they're not. And it's often due to this. They're nice because they're repressing or suppressing anger. They're not bringing out stuff that is really present for them. And it's just not never getting any kind of way to be released. It's going internally and it's doing something in the body. He talks a lot about this mind-body connection. And the effects of that unexplored trauma working itself out on our immune system. And as I was working on this talk, there's a guy on the train sitting opposite me, with notifications off silent, getting notifications pinged every like 5 seconds. And I'm wondering, what the heck is this doing to me as I'm wrestling with my inner rage? So the next point is attachment and authenticity. And I think this is a core theme in the book for me, which jumped out, which was this idea that there's a tension between our needs when we're young as a baby for attachment, and that attachment desire is present throughout our lives, but it's also in contrast and conflict with this desire for authenticity, to be our authentic selves. And so he defines attachment as the drive for closeness and proximity to others, not just physically, but emotionally, and authenticity, the quality of being true to oneself and the capacity to shape one's own life from a deep knowledge of that self. So with authenticity, it's not just a luxury, but it's the drive is actually rooted in survival. It means knowing our gut feelings and honoring them. So right back to when we were, on the savannah, and we felt that the hair stand up in the back of our neck, and we knew there was something that was not right, and we needed to be aware of it for our survival. This drive today, there's something about, he talks about wanting to be authentic in order to really fully express who we are. And if we don't do that, something inside us is not happy. And when we have this dilemma of the need for attachment conflicting with the need for authenticity, then that's when we really can come into this conflict, and we sometimes choose attachment over authentic connection and expression. So someone who's not validated or recognized for who she is early in life may develop an outsized appetite for status or wealth. If we are not made to feel important just for who we are, we may seek significance by becoming compulsive helpers. Yeah. And there's a strange part that many of these compensations for what we lost can be seen as normal or even admirable. So he talks a lot about examples of, where people were, they're going above and beyond, or they're the entrepreneurs that have pushed to, the heights of success, but around them, everything else is actually in chaos. And we applaud that. Or somebody who constantly just puts people before other needs before them. Again, people say this person's amazing, but actually what they're doing is really hurting their authentic expression of who they are and what their needs really are. And then that goes on to create, that comes from trauma, and it creates illness in the body. So he's got another section for me. The fourth one is children and education. And again, being a dad of 3 kids, this is really relevant and interesting. He talks about the emotional rather than intellectual interaction serves as the mind's primary architect. So emotional rather than just intellectual interaction is the mind's primary architect. And children need our help, and our education system isn't often not helping them. So basically, we're bringing up our kids in this environment where we're telling them, even whether it's in schools or just in the home, if you behave, you get attachment. But if you express yourself in a way that's not pleasing to us, you'll get punished. And that can often create this sense of, well, if I want to attach, if I want to be liked, I have to behave in a certain way. And that's when things can start to go wrong, and we don't feel like we can bring that authentic. Whereas when we're babies, we've got no problem with that. When we're babies, we just bring that authenticity very genuinely, and hopefully we get put up with. I thought that was interesting that, he talks a lot about how we often, when we meet another human, it's the body language and the signals that are coming up through that represent how we're going to feel towards that other person. And children feel that too. So a child's sense of security, trust in the world, and connection with their authentic emotions hinge on the consistent availability of attuned, non-stressed, and emotionally reliable caregivers, which doesn't sound like me as a parent very often. The more stressed or distracted the latter, the shakier the emotional architecture of the child's mind will be. So yeah, children must feel an invitation to exist in our presence exactly the way they are. And if that can happen, then they can build that foundation. And they need permission to feel their emotions, especially grief, anger, sadness, and pain. And that just came up again and again, not just for children, but for us as adults as well. In other words, the safety to remain vulnerable. They can be who they are and continue to express that. So yeah, for emotions to remain accessible, the environment must allow them to be safely experienced, meaning the child's expression of feelings cannot threaten the attachment relationship with the parents. He also talks about the experience of free play in order to mature. The play system may be especially important for the development of maturation in the brain, and it may be contributing to ADHD as well as adult irritability and aggression. He talks about authentic play agenda, free, interactive, engaging joy, imagination, person to person, and how as a society we're not fostering that very much, especially now that we've moved into to screens and that sort of our primary way of connecting. So the fifth point quickly is the compassion of curiosity and understanding. He actually talks about 5 different types of compassion in the book and sort of wrapping it up. But this was the one that stood out for me, the compassion of curiosity and understanding. This type of compassion stems from the belief that everything exists for a reason and that reason matters. And it's about asking without judgment why a person or a group would end up being the way they are and act the way they do, even or especially when we are annoyed or perplexed by it. Which I love. It's a big value for me to be able to try and hear another person's point of view rather than just, assume that they're an idiot. However sincere our desire to help ourselves or someone else, we cannot do so without looking at the suffering being experienced and knowing its source as best we can. And he's not just talking about feeling bad for people. He's saying that we need to understand the pain in their lives that they've been driven to escape and how their wounds were sustained. And if we can do that, then they can be felt and they can move forward. He talks about this a lot in relation to addiction, and the need of addicts just to feel normal, and that's really what they're looking for often when they're in that cycle. And as we see the world becoming more bipartisan, it just feels like this compassion is really this curiosity to the other point of view is something that could really help here. So yeah, that's a whirlwind of the book. To summarize, trauma is a wound that many of us carry, whether it's big T trauma or small T trauma. We carry it with us into relationships and perpetuate it as a society unless we actively work to heal it. Suppression, not releasing our authentic expression, especially our anger, is increasingly proven to cause illness within our bodies as well as our minds. Authenticity, there's a battle in us between our needs for attachment and authenticity, and it's important to really understand our gut feelings when they arise and honor them. Children need our help, and our education system and our unhealed wound as parents are not helping them. And compassion, if we're to dream of a healthier, less fractured world, we will have to harness and amplify compassion's healing power.